And it's a profound pleasure for me to be here. And I think just to give you a little bit of my history, which I'm having a problem changing my slide already. Is this a bad thing? Okay, let's see. Okay, here we are. So I came to this community in 1986, and I began practicing obstetrics and gynecology at John Muir Hospital. And I had a thriving practice and was having a great life with my wife, Dale, and our 3 children. Everything seemed to be going so well. And at the age of 49, I was diagnosed with a stage 2 melanoma. It was a disease that terrified me. And despite treatment, my disease progressed. And within 3 years, I had to retire because of aggressive and disabling surgery. Less than 2 years later, I was diagnosed with stage 4 disease with a prognosis of less than 7 months. Throughout that experience, I had moments of anxiety and fear, but they were relieved by the memory of psychedelic experiences I had had in my 20s. And those experiences changed my view of the world and of consciousness in profound ways, and they continue to inform me today. I now work at Hospice of the East Bay and have a private practice counseling patients with life-threatening illness. The anxiety patients feel is of profound importance to me. It robs us of the time that remains. I always said to myself when I was really sick, how stupid it would be to waste the time that remained worrying about dying. Our fears of mortality run very deep. Oblivion is a hard pill to swallow. The field of psychedelic psychotherapy and psychedelic medicine offer a remarkable opportunity to reframe our perception of death. I believe it is at its heart is the ability for these compounds to alter our notion of consciousness and the self. As the self becomes diminished, a radical shift may occur in perspective that provides us with a viewpoint that is both magnificent and deeply reassuring. The story I will present tonight involves a rich history, which is important to understand where we are today, and I look forward to sharing it with you. So I'll make the statement, and many might argue with it, but I think it is actually true. For tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years, the mystical experience produced by altered states of consciousness have played a part in the evolution of human creativity, technology, and spirituality. The experience of ecstasy, our concept of the soul and of death. So I think it's nice to start at the beginning. And we're going to go way back, and we're going to think about something that has been referred to as the stoned ape hypothesis, which was posited by this gentleman, a very smart guy, who I read 30 years ago and thought many of his notions were very outlandish and crazy, but I have come to appreciate him. His name is Terence McKenna, and he wrote 2 profound books, Archaic Revival and Food of the Gods. And I think I want to change the name of the stoned ape hypothesis, which was initially described this hypothesis. I would change it to the awakened ape hypothesis. And this hypothesis suggests that we owe the emergence of language and self-reflection to ancient and sustained consumption of psilocybin mushrooms. The exact timeline for the emergence of consciousness varies. The process may have begun as far back as 2 million years ago, involving pre-human hominids. McKenna's hypothesis was that low doses of psilocybin improves visual acuity, making early hominins better hunters. Psilocybin could trigger activity in language-forming regions of the brain, in a sense, a form of synesthesia. He believed that psilocybin mushrooms were the evolutionary catalyst from which language, projective imagination, arts, religion, philosophy, science, and all human culture sprang, which is a big statement. When I first read this about 30 years ago, I thought it was kind of an outlandish idea, but people continue to revisit this hypothesis, and it stands more securely now than it has in the past. It is a theory only, but recent literature has actually continues to support this idea. In fact, there's literature showing that fear responses related to the notion of PTSD in mice are altered and improved by the addition of low doses of psilocybin. And so we'll talk about this more, but let's look further down the line at some of the images that we see in the cave paintings. We see Lascaux's prehistoric cave paintings that go back 20,000 years. We see Chavot's caves in southern France. These are perhaps some of the oldest images in the world. And what generated these fantastical images, and what brought about the evolution of the brain to be able to suddenly move to create these amazing images? We also look at the very nature of these petroglyph symbols, and we see similarities and commonalities with these petroglyphs throughout the world. We know that in non-ordinary states of consciousness, particularly with psychedelics, entopic images frequently emerge. These visual effects are those whose source is within the eye itself. These relate to the nerve structures that are part of the optic nerve, the vascular structures of the retina, various elements of the vitreous humor. And the characteristics of these non-ordinary visual experiences are quite similar. They involve abstract geometric patterns, gratings, lattices, filigrees, honeycombs, checkerboards, cobwebs, tunnels, spirals, cones. We see similarities of these images throughout the world. Intriguingly, these forms resemble many of the abstract motifs that we see here in these prehistoric images. And we have to wonder what generated these? How is there such similarity? We can also look to the Greeks. The ceremonies that took place, which were these initiations every year for the cult of Demeter and Persephone, were part of the Pan-Hellenic sanctuary of Eleusis in ancient Greece. They are the most famous of the secret religious rites of ancient Greece. The initiators were involved in visions. The initiations were involved in visions and the conjuring of the afterlife. These ceremonies continued to be a significant aspect of Greek culture for over 2 millennia. And many scholars believe that the power and the longevity of these rites and ceremonies came from the psychedelic drugs, which are presumed to have perhaps been used during them. We know that the kykeon, which is the brew made of water and barley and wine and grated cheese that was used before the climax of the initiation, was a sacred potion consisting of barley, mint, and perhaps, and what you're seeing right here is actually a psilocybin mushroom, which is actually seen in hieroglyphics in Egypt. And perhaps this kykeon was also had within it a barley ergot, which has psychoactive properties and could have triggered the intense experiences alluded to by the participants. Now, as polytheism faded and Christianity ascended, it is thought that these ceremonies continued. And if you look at St. Paul's Monastery and Mount Athos in Greece, we see this phrase, the translation, "If you die before you die, then you will not die when you die." This is a profound statement, and we wonder, does this refer to the ego dissolving experience associated with psychedelic compounds? Now, this has been written about extensively, and actually there's recently a new book out, which is great, called The Immortality Key, which posits the possibility that the Kikion rituals of ancient Greece evolved to become the Eucharist of early Christianity. Now, let's move to more modern times. And I think a discussion of a presentation that was made by William James around the turn of the century, 1902, in Edinburgh, called The Varieties of Religious Experience, actually turns out to be a seminal work and is incorporated into psychedelic research related to end-of-life anxiety much later, and continues to be influential. William James was a trained physician and taught anatomy at Harvard. He actually never practiced medicine, but he pursued interests in psychology, then philosophy. James wrote widely on topics including epistemology, education, metaphysics, psychology, and religion, and actually wrote the first seminal textbook on psychology called The Principles of Psychology, which was a groundbreaking text. And he is credited with describing something for the first time, which are the 7 characteristics of the mystical experience. These characteristics involve, first, ineffability. In other words, the experience is beyond language. The words to describe what is happening to the individual are very difficult to put together. And it is, in a sense, beyond language. The experience has a noetic quality. In a sense, it is a revelation of hidden knowledge. And embodied in that noetic knowledge is the notion of that there is deep and self-evident truth embodied in that knowledge. Transiency. The experience is fleeting. It comes and then it is gone. Many people spend the rest of their lives pursuing that experience again. There is a sense of passivity to it. In other words, it happens outside of your control. Your efforts to once again reestablish that experience seems to be, in fact, may make it even more difficult. And this is a very important one, unity of opposites. This is a sense of oneness, a sense of non-duality, a sense of two opposite notions. We could say good and evil could be held together at the same time, and it is in fact embraced. There is a timelessness to it. When the experience happens, it seems to be outside of time. And finally, it's a feeling that somehow in this process, we have encountered our true self. These characteristics will come up later, and this forms seminal elements of research to follow. Now, let's come to this gentleman, Albert Hofmann. He is a Swiss chemist. He was the first person to synthesize lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. He was a chemist working for Sandoz Pharmaceuticals and was studying actually a fungus, and synthesized LSD in 1938. He was working with a compound that might stimulate uterine contractions and control postpartum hemorrhage. The compound was shelved for about 5 years. And while he was resynthesizing it, 5 years later, he inadvertently dosed himself. He was uncomfortable with how he was feeling, but intrigued. And 3 days later, he intentionally ingested 250 micrograms on April 19th, 1943. 250 micrograms was a microscopic, minuscule dose. Of such low concentration, he felt quite assured that there would be no physiologic effects. Less than an hour later, Hoffman experienced sudden and intense changes in perception. He asked his laboratory assistant to escort him home. As customary in Basel, they made the journey by bicycle. And members of the psychedelic community celebrate Bicycle Day, celebrating this. Hoffman's condition rapidly deteriorated as he struggled with feelings of anxiety, alternating in his beliefs that his next door neighbor was a malevolent witch, and that he was going insane, and that LSD had poisoned him permanently. When a house doctor arrived, he could detect no physical abnormalities. His vital signs were absolutely normal. The only noticeable physical change were a set of dilated pupils. Hoffman was reassured, and soon his terror began to give way to a sense of good fortune and enjoyment. As he wrote, little by little, I could begin to enjoy the unprecedented colors and shapes that persisted behind my closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in colored fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in a constant flux. Hoffman lived to the great age of 102 and stayed active and vital throughout his life. He viewed the compound as profound and sacred, but he was aware of the power that it embodied. The book that he wrote on it was, the subtitle was LSD, My Problem Child. And in that he describes its enormous impact on the culture. And, but he was the progenitor of much to follow. So when Sandoz made the medication, when Sandoz realized that this medication was potentially significant, it still didn't really know what to do with it. So it produced the medication and allowed it to be available to researchers and clinicians. And at that time, Sandoz would, if you requested the drug, it would be sent to you by Sandoz. There were very few limitations on it. And two of the most important researchers was a man named Humphrey Osmond and Abram Hoffer. Both were Canadian psychiatrists. The two psychiatrists worked in Canada and conducted a variety of patient studies and observations using LSD and mescaline. They noted that the compounds produced similar effects to schizophrenia, and they were convinced, and that convinced them that schizophrenia, the disease, was caused by an imbalance in the brain. There were similarities actually between mescaline and adrenaline, which gave them the notion that there was perhaps an internal metabolic problem that was responsible for psychosis and schizophrenia. LSD was initially referred to as a psychotomimetic. In other words, it mimics psychosis. They also saw similarities between delirium tremors and the LSD experience. In practicing with alcoholics, delirium tremors were frequently a conversion experience for the patients. That experience was so frightening that it resulted in sobriety. They began to work with alcoholics with LSD, thinking it could aid in the recovery. And they worked with hundreds of patients, and many of them achieved long-term sobriety. The notion of the experience and not the drug itself was the effective part of the treatment began to emerge. This began a shift in focus to the subjective experience. As their experiences deepened, they recognized that the experience was not one of madness, but of transcendence and insight. Perhaps cure was occurring because of new, profound understanding of the self and one's own behavior. They also began to understand that the experience could be greatly enhanced by having an engaged and empathetic therapist present. Before that time, frequently patients were dosed with LSD and they were left alone in a hospital bed. This would evolve, these notions and these early ideas would evolve to notions of set, and setting in the years to come. Now, here's Aldous Huxley, and he was one of the people, because of his eminence as a writer and a philosopher, his appreciation of psychedelic compounds was extremely important in promulgating these ideas within the population. He had written he's written nearly 50 books, both novels and nonfictions, was widely acknowledged as one of the foremost intellectuals of his time, and was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 9 times. He grew interested in the philosophy of mysticism and the commonalities of Western and Eastern mysticism. In the spring of 1953, Huxley had his first experience with the psychedelic drug mescaline and wrote The Doors of Perception in 1954, 1 year later. On his deathbed, he was unable to speak because of advanced laryngeal cancer. Huxley made a written request to his wife, Laura, to inject him with 100 micrograms of LSD. She obliged with the injection at 11:20 a.m. in the morning and a second dose an hour later. Huxley died at the age of 69 at 5:20 on November 2nd, 1963, which actually happened to be the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated. Now, Huxley referred to his psychedelic experiences multiple times in many of his books. And one of his last books, Island, he began exploring ideas about death, palliative care, and the loss of spirit. And he wrote this: the dying face, increasing pain, increasing anxiety, increasing morphine, with the ultimate disintegration of personality and the loss of opportunity to die with dignity. Now, the understanding and appreciation of psychedelic compounds would be opened up massively with the publication of this Life magazine article. The person responsible for that article was a man named Gordon Wasson. And he was an American author, an ethnomycologist, and actually vice president for public relations at JP Morgan. Gordon and his physician wife, Valentina, mounted expeditions to Mexico to study the religious use of mushrooms by the native population, and claimed to have been the first Westerners to participate in a Mazatec mushroom ritual. It was the curandera, Marie Sabina, who both allowed the Wassons to participate in the witch ritual and taught them about the uses and effects of the mushroom. Sabina let him take her picture on the condition she would keep it private, but Wasson nonetheless published the photo along with Sabina's name and the name of the community where she lived. In May 1957, Life magazine published the article titled "Seeking the Magic Mushroom," which introduced psychoactive mushrooms to a wide audience for the first time. 6 days later, an account of the research expedition in Mexico was published on the cover of This Week, a Sunday magazine, inserted in 37 newspapers, which reached almost 12 million total readers. Now, so there was a move there was a spread of information popularizing these compounds, but the research that was going on in the medical community was active and vibrant. One of the participants in this research was a physician named Eric Cast, and he wrote a number of articles related to the action of LSD and its impact on pain. One of his most important articles was the analgesic action of the lysergic acid compared with dihydromorphone and meperidine. And he was beginning, and he later understood the therapeutic use of LSD, and in his article, Attenuation and Anticipation, this article here was really important because he was the first person to start talking about that LSD did not have an impact directly on pain. It was not a pain medication in and of itself, but what it was having an impact on the meaning of the pain. We think a lot, I think a lot about the meaning of pain. If you compare the meaning of gradually enlarging tumor resting on a nerve and the meaning of that neuropathic pain, which is profound, but it is also the horrific and foreboding meaning of encroaching and advancing cancer, as opposed to the pain that we sustain, that women sustain in the state of parturition, in which the pain is meaningful in a completely other way, and that is in giving new life. So what Cast is suggesting is that meaning is being impacted by the LSD and not the pain itself. Now, the next significant player in all of this is a physician named Sidney Cohen. He was a psychiatrist who worked at the Wadsworth VA in Los Angeles, as well as the UCLA School of Medicine. And the quote here speaks directly to an extension of the ideas that Cast was presenting, was that LSD, it would seem that LSD does not act directly on the part of the brain that receives pain impulses, and instead it appears to alter the meaning of the pain, and in doing so diminishes it. So it turns out that the 50s and the early 60s were very robust periods of time for research involving this compound. And although our applications of the research was crude, there was still a very, very strong indication that the potential value of these compounds were extensive and profound. And then come along these two individuals, Richard Albert on the right and Timothy Leary on the left. Now, to the uninformed, we might think that these two individuals represent the leading edge of psychedelic research. In fact, they came onto the scene late and were present for a relatively brief period of time. Leary's first introduction to psilocybin mushrooms were in August of 1960. And Richard Albert and Timothy Leary were fired in 1963, so just 3 years later. Turns out that they were the first two professors to be fired from Harvard University in 100 years. Prior to their firing, they began a research program known as the Harvard Psilocybin Project. And two notable projects were the Concord Prison Experiment and the Marsh Chapel Experiment. The Concord Prison Experiment involved the administration of psilocybin to assist in group therapy with 32 prisoners in an effort to reduce recidivism. The results actually showed a significant reduction in recidivism from a baseline of 64% to 25%. The results,
change your health plan with Kaiser.
The results were, hold on, I think someone needs to mute if they can.
Okay.
The results were contested and could not be repeated. Additionally, the scientific legitimacy and the ethics of the research were questioned because the researchers themselves took the psychedelics along with research subjects. As it turns out, the dismissal was actually a fairly sordid,
Robert, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, how long have I been going on?
Oh, a minute.
No, about 10 seconds.
Okay. So anyway, the point is that the Concord Prison experiment involved the administration of psilocybin to assist in group psychotherapy with 32 prisoners. and it actually did reduce recidivism rate from 64 to 25%. But the results could not be repeated. And there were issues because the researchers were taking the drugs with the prisoners. There was a justification for that, but it crossed ethical bounds, and it really it really disrupted the profundity of the research. But perhaps more important and much more related to what we're talking about tonight is the Good Friday Marsh Chapel experiment. This was actually done by Walter Penke, working with Albert and Leary. And in 1962, he took a group of divinity students and divided them into 10 matched pairs, 10 students receiving a drug, niacin, which produces flushing and some mild changes in consciousness. And then the other drug was psilocybin. This was to be a double-blind experiment, and it was one of the first experiments related to the notion of a mystical experience and the impact of a mystical experience on the long-term psychology of its participants. Now, here we see some of the results, and these are results of the mystical experience questionnaire that was administered. If you look at these categories, they relate directly back to the William James work, and it shows a persistence of effects. This initial questionnaire was administered right after the experience, and then was done in follow-up 6 months later. And the important information here is that all of these elements, the notion of unity, both internal and external, of transience of time, of deeply felt positive mood, of sacredness, of paradoxality, which is once again this unity of opposites, alleged ineffability and transiency. These participants continue to score high in these areas 6 months after the experiment. This will come up again, but this was really the first, though, important experiment related to the idea of a mystical experience and how it might affect, in a long-term way, the perceptions of the world. So let's move on. So we are now firmly in the 60s. And here we see the bus named Further and Ken Kesey on top of the bus. It appears, I like this picture because it appears that there's an element of being out of control. And Ken Kesey had his first LSD experience participating at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital. It turns out that the research that he was participating in was sponsored by the CIA as part of the MK Ultra program. And it was the agency's decade-long effort to determine whether LSD could be weaponized. In some respects, it actually was weaponized in the form of the merry pranksters, acid tests, and the cultural upheaval that followed. And now, here we have, as we're heading towards 1970, we have Timothy Leary, who is being described by the Nixon administration as one of the most dangerous men in the world. We have Ram Dass, who has left psychedelic research and is studying meditative practices in India. This is, in a sense, a cautionary tale. And we'll get back to this more, and it relates directly to as we move forward. But it is a cautionary tale which is quite relevant as we move forward today, because looking back at the events that transpired, what emerges is the profound power embodied in these compounds. A primary mystical experience has long-term transformative power. It also speaks an undeniable truth, engendering breathtaking authority. Such authority is rarely relinquished by governments and other hierarchies of power. Researchers today in 2021 worry constantly about the mistakes that were made in the 60s. They also worry chronically and consistently about the unbridled optimism bordering on evangelicalism, which as being a hazard of work in this area. And so then we come to this moment, 1970, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. This placed mescaline, psilocybin, and LSD prohibition into effect, and it began the vast majority of research projects to an abrupt end. It should be noted that at that time, when this was passed, a robust underground movement began and continues and continued and continues on to this day. Now, a new person comes into the process, and he really begins actively involved in 1985. At that time, another compound that we will not talk about extensively today was MDMA. This in the street is referred to as ecstasy, E, or Molly. And at that time in 1985, it was placed into a Schedule I category. And that was in the context of rising recreational use. It was placed as a Schedule I drug, despite the fact that it had been shown to have significant therapeutic potential with PTSD, depression, substance abuse, disorders, and many other psychological problems. And there were strong indicators that it could accelerate the process of psychotherapy. The loss of this drug, which was being used actively by psychiatrists all over the United States and all over the world, prompted Rick Doblin to start an organization referred to as MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And his motivation was to establish new rigor to psychedelic studies with the goal of changing the status of MDMA and making it available to patients once again. He also brought actually new rigor to the Marsh Chapel experiment we just talked about. And in one of his important articles, which he published, was a long-term follow-up and methodological critique to the Good Friday experiment. If you remember, we saw this just a few slides ago. He actually contacted every participant in that experiment and re-administered questionnaires related to these elements embodied in the mystical experience. 24 to 27 years had passed. And if you look at the scores, patients scored the same, if not higher, in all of these characters, in all of these qualities. This is an important piece of research because the notion that a psychedelic drug-induced experience did not have the same power or significance as a non-drug induced mystical experience had always been questioned. And with this literature, we saw that was seriously addressed. And we are seeing here evidence that these experiences stay with the individual, just as the experiences that I described in my 20s stay with me now at the age of 69. So we're still in a state of prohibition. And now we come to the 90s. And this group of people become part of the central cast of characters that begin a reinvigorated research wave and renaissance related to psychedelic therapy. Bob Jesse, the gentleman in the left, was one of the early employees of Oracle as an electrical and computer engineer. and in his college years had a profound non-dual experience. And he believed strongly in the power and benefit of these compounds, and I worked in the background to bring people together to create a new wave of research. And he met a gentleman named Bob Schuster. Bob Schuster was actually, kind of a Reagan Republican, but a very earnest person, and did believe that there was value in these compounds, and spoke with Bob about how they might work together to reestablish and generate a new wave of rigorous research to bring these compounds to light again for clinical medicine. And Bob knew actually a great researcher, a guy named Ronald Griffiths, and he had done a lot of work actually with caffeine, and was a splendid researcher and a rigorous scientist. And he felt that this would be the appropriate person for Bob Jesse to work with. And Bill Richards, a very important person and an experienced psychedelic researcher at the Spring Grove Hospital, who held advanced degrees in both psychology and divinity, had worked with psychedelics extensively. And he was brought on board to be part of this new wave of research, which took a long time to happen. This initially happened in the 90s, and some of the first research didn't come out until 2011. The first researcher was by another gentleman who published the first pilot study, Charles Grob. And this pilot study of psilocybin for the treatment of anxiety in patients with advanced cancer. I think only 12 patients were involved. And the results were, despite limitations, the study demonstrates that careful and controlled use of psilocybin may provide an alternative model for the treatment of conditions that are only minimally responsive to conventional therapies, including the profound existential anxiety and despair that often accompanies advanced stage cancer. Now, on the heels of that was the article done by the Hopkins Group, in which Ronald Griffiths and Bill Richards were involved. And the title of this article is "Psilocybin Produces Substantial and Sustained Decreases in Depression and Anxiety in Patients with Life-Threatening Cancer, a Randomized Double-Blind Trial." And the significance of this was that this chart shows a relationship between the significance of the mystical experience, and in other words, what you scored on the questionnaire, the more you stated that you had a mystical experience, the more profound and long-lasting that experience was. And so there's a correlation between that. And more importantly, or actually not more importantly, but important from a chemistry standpoint and a dosing standpoint, we saw that there was a direct dosage relationship with the quality of the mystical experience. In other words, the greater the dose to a certain point, the more likely a profound mystical experience would occur. These are some of the other statements that were made in that article. High-dose psilocybin produced a large decrease in clinician and self-rated measures of depressed mood and anxiety, along with increases in quality of life, life meaning and optimism, and decreases in death anxiety. At 6-month follow-up, these changes were sustained, with about 80% of the participants continuing to show clinically significant decreases in depressed mood and anxiety. Participants attributed improvements in attitude about life, self, and mood, relationships, and spirituality to the high-dose experience, with more than 80% endorsing moderately or greater increased well-being and life satisfaction. Community observer rating showed corresponding changes. Then soon after that was another group that was working along the same lines with a third study. And this was a group working out of NYU, Stephen Roth and Anthony Bossis. And they state in their title, rapid and sustained symptom reduction following psilocybin treatment for anxiety and depression in patients with life-threatening cancer, a randomized controlled trial. They state single moderate doses of psilocybin in conjunction with psychotherapy produced rapid, robust, and sustained clinical benefits in terms of reduction of anxiety and depression in patients with life-threatening cancer. This pharmacological finding is novel in psychiatry in terms of a single dose of a medication leading to immediate antidepressant and anxiolytic effects with enduring clinical benefits. Psilocybin decreased cancer-related demoralization, which is loss of meaning, hope, and purpose, and a desire for hastened death and hopelessness, while improving spiritual well-being, general life satisfaction, and quality of life. So let's take a look more granularly at the actual experiment. And this speaks to the rigor and care involved in this experimental design. The patient is actually, there's preparation with the patient involving 3 psychotherapeutic sessions. This is to establish trust and a therapeutic alliance between the facilitators and the patient. This involves 3 sessions of 6 hours of this. This occurs 2 to 4 weeks before the actual first dosage. And the patient is also seen as part of that 1 day before the dosage. There is a post-integrative sessions in which what has happened is discussed and integrated over 3 sessions. Once again, 2 hours apiece. This is 6 hours of psychotherapy over a 7-week period, and which includes a preparatory experience 1 day before the second dosage. Once again, a post-integrative, a 3-session experience totaling 6 hours, and then ongoing support and integration with the study therapist, which goes on for a full 26 weeks after. This is a crossover study, which is in which both niacin and psilocybin are involved, which means that those patients that received psilocybin at dose 1 received niacin on dose 2, and those that received niacin on dose 1 received psilocybin on dose 2. And the patients were blinded to what they were receiving, as well as the therapists and facilitators that were involved with the patient. So no one knew what they had received. Although I will say that there were strong suspicions during the course of the therapy and the experience. So let's talk a little bit. I want to move now to talk a little bit about the compounds that we're talking about, which are the classical psychedelics. We refer to these as 5-HT2A receptor agonists. And these are the classical psychedelics. And of the classical psychedelics, we talk about, we speak of LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT, which is dimethyltryptamine. Now, DMT is actually the active ingredient, psychedelic ingredient in ayahuasca. And taken in an ayahuasca ritual, the experience may last for 3 to 4 hours when ingested orally, but DMT is frequently smoked or vaporized. And in that situation, the experience is between 10 and 45 minutes. Mescaline, the experience is between 10 and 12 hours. Psilocybin, 4 to 6, LSD, 6 to 12. Now, many people ask, why did this initial thrust of research involve the use of psilocybin and not mescaline, LSD or DMT? It relates really directly to the signatures of these compounds and something probably else. First of all, LSD was ruled out because of the cultural baggage of the compound. It was determined we did not want to be using LSD, that would create too much negativity in press. Psilocybin tested much more benignly in focus groups. Much people knew less about what psilocybin meant, and there was much less negative connotation. So, but also more importantly, the signature of 4 to 6 hours. Keep in mind, we're going to be talking about the idea is that maybe this could be used in scale with a lot of therapy for a lot of patients in the world who are experiencing death anxiety. And that involves therapists that have to sit with the patient for 7 or 8 hours. We want a shorter drug just to be easier and kinder to the therapists that are involved in the therapy. So now let's talk a little bit more about these 5-HT2A receptors. This receptor is part of the serotonin receptor family. And these medications are agonists of serotonin. And the receptor is a G protein cell surface receptor, which is present throughout the nervous system and throughout the body, in fact. And this modulates key circuits in the brain involved in sensory, perception, and cognition. Now, how does it change that? Well, there's so much to learn about that, so much we don't know. We see shadows and images that may reflect specific changes in neurologic function, but the exact nature of those changes is still far beyond our abilities to understand or to study. But we believe that this relates directly to what we refer to as the default mode network. The default mode network is actually the low energy brain state of normal consciousness. As it turns out, the brain uses up more calories than any other part of our body, and we are always trying to conserve energy. So consciousness seeks the lowest state of entropy. And so once we define those patterns, we stay in those patterns. Frequently, people talk about the patterns of the default network like the grooves on snow with skis, and that once one person has skied freshly fallen snow, a groove is established, and those grooves go deeper and deeper and deeper, which means we are more likely to follow the same circuitry all the time. Now, there are beautiful images of the default mode network. They're easy to access. All you have to do is look them up on Wikipedia, and there they are. But these images describe the patterns of circuitry that are involved in these modes of thinking. And when we are at rest and we're involved in what we would think of as normal restful consciousness, there are many ways that our minds wander, and we think about the same things frequently. We think about others. We think about their thoughts. We have empathy. We think about what it is like to be them. We think about justice and fairness. We think about social characteristics and our status. We think about the neurologic basis that provides the neurologic basis of self, which means we think chronically about our autobiographical information, our self-reference, and the emotion of oneself. And we are also chronically thinking about the past and the future. We're remembering the past, imagining the future. We're having episodic memory. And involved in that is we have the comprehension of story. And with the comprehension of story, we have meaning. This is the way we think normally. And when we develop a mode of thinking, we tend to repeat it. And it may be that many neuroses, many notions of depression, many notions of neurosis may be based in abnormalities of our default network. And what we know about these compounds is that they radically and completely disrupt the default network, which means that we think in utterly and completely different ways because the circuits that are activated and are involved are utterly different than the ones that we do when we are in normal thought and involved in our normal brain activity. And then the visualization of these changes are done, is a computer model activated from functional MRIs, which looks like this. This is the normal brain activating a few pathways, and those pathways are frequently activated repetitively. And then on psilocybin, we see an entire new integration of other patterns of thinking. Do we know much more than that? I think that we know elements about the phenomenology of the LSD experience and what people describe. But beyond that, we don't know much more, and there is so much more to learn. One of the things that we have learned, though, in terms of our clinical understanding about how to manage patients, is that we're understanding the significance of set and setting. Actually, one of the most important things that Timothy Leary did was he described much of this in some of his writings, talking about the importance of set, which is the orientation, the attitudes, the life history, the expectation, and the intention of the patient coming into the experience. So, and we also know that setting, which is the physical and social environment of the experience, have profound impact on the experience. Much of the debacles of the 60s were a result of not thoroughly appreciating the importance and value of set and setting, and how profoundly important it is in terms of impacting the nature of the psychedelic experience. And as Timothy Leary states here, the drug acts as a chemical key which opens the mind. The nature of the experience depends almost entirely on the set and setting. Now, part of this is as we are having more experience clinically with these compounds, we fall back on some basic philosophy about the ability of the brain, as we see it clinically with patients that are exposed to these compounds, to heal itself. And this is a fundamental philosophy that is engendered in psychedelic psychotherapy. The idea that the body is the entity that knows how to heal itself. If someone goes to the emergency room with a laceration, a doctor can remove obstacles to healing, remove a foreign body, or treat infection. It can help create favorable conditions for healing. The physician may sew the edges of a wound to close the wound, but the doctor does not direct or cause the healing that ensues. The body initiates the remarkable, complex, and sophisticated healing process, and always spontaneously attempts to move toward healing. The psyche, too, exhibits an innate healing intelligence and capacity. So let's look a little bit about what the experience looks like. This is a picture of one of the rooms used during the Hopkins work with Bill Richards and Roland Griffith. Usually two therapists are traditionally involved, both a man and a woman. The use of a blindfold or of a mask to block out light is frequently used. The patient may take the mask off at times. Usually the patient may be wearing headphones, and music is integral to the experience. There is an effort. Obviously, this room is appointed in a way but this frequently is a room in a hospital. During the research, was a room in a hospital, which with all medical equipment readily available. But obviously, we want to change the set and the setting by changing the physical environment of the room, to not over-medicalize it, to create in itself a sense of anxiety or threat. Now, there are fundamental principles of navigation of the experience. First, the establishment of a bond of trust and this takes time. This cannot be, you cannot shortcut this process. This is established during the preparatory sessions, which establishes rapport and trust and helps the facilitator and the patient establish a notion of intention and a sense of trust. There's an underlying assurance of presence and support. The patient is never left alone. There is a normalization of physical contact, but it is never sexual, and that is openly discussed between therapist and patient, and that is a sacred element of this exchange. Hand holding is practiced, and physical touch may occur to reassure the patient. The entire spectrum of thought and emotion is welcome. Now, the statement, this is that, and then this is a statement made by Bill Richards, and I think it's profound. Courageous acceptance, welcoming of all opportunities. And embodied in that idea is the reality that if something enters the field, the hallucinatory field, particularly if it is dark or threatening, one is to approach it with a desire to learn. You stare, if the dragon presents itself, you stare the dragon in the eye, you stare into the pupil. If a door presents itself, you open the door. If a stairway presents it, you go up. You view all opportunities and welcome them. Using the dragon metaphor, you stare into the eye of the dragon. The dragon is there to teach you. You become the dragon. But I will say that this is done within the context of reassurance, and requires that continued reassurance. There are moments of suffering, rarely moments of panic, but there are moments of embodying what we call, once again, the unity of opposites that engenders suffering. And the facilitators encourage and prepare the patients to move into and through the suffering. Once again, move into and through. This is the part of the healing process for many. And the patient should never feel that they are disappointing the facilitators if they are having difficult experience. The role of music is profound. It creates flow and movement, a sense of ascent or progression. A pre-programmed playlist is essential, and collaborative creation of the playlist may help in setting intention. There are usually external speakers and headphones with separate volumes. The structure for psilocybin sessions is 7 to 8 hours. Arrival, this includes arrival and ingestion, music specifically designed for onset and ascent, music for early peak, later peak, the symbolic archetypal plane, and reentry and return. And specific music selections are selected for those intentionally. So that's a little bit about the experience. And now let's talk about a little bit about the great beast that we are all fearful of, and what ultimately this is about. A tough pill. The notion of oblivion for my patients, for all of us as human beings, is something that operates throughout our lives. All of us are afraid of the potential oblivion associated with end of life. Ernest Becker wrote an amazing book called The Denial of Death, and in it, he posits the notion that it is not our sexual desires that motivate us in life, it is actually our profound and deep underlying fear of death. So I will talk a little bit about why does a transcendent experience change our notion of oblivion? Well, I think it changes our notion of oblivion because perhaps it gives us an out. Perhaps it gives us a way to perceive or perceive what is really going on that we can't know in a normal state of consciousness. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I like to show two images. They're disturbing images, and they are actually a manifestation of the Pixar group. But I think it is interesting. These two, I do actually believe that this particular 5 minutes of cinema in Toy Story 2 were the most profound representations of end-of-life anxiety and the notion of oblivion. And this is when Woody and his comrades are facing utter annihilation. It is an amazing period of film. It is actually one that exists for only a few minutes, a very few minutes, but it is a start, and it is ultimately resolved. But this is a deeply, deeply uncomfortable moment in which Woody understands the very nature of his situation. And then it results in what we see sometimes in human beings when they feel that death is near, and we refer to this as demoralization. And here we have a visual example of demoralization. I think that what is so disruptive to our consciousness is that the notion of being conscious is so profound and important and so central to our existence that the idea that that is gone is so shaking that it's unbearable. And I think that the notion of transcendence is really important to all of us, that it can give us a perspective change that is deeply reassuring and I think deeply important. And truly, in my own view of the world, I think these ideas and notions are probably much more real than anything else. I think an important statement was done by a physician. His name was Eric Cassell in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1982. And this was actually a very seminal article related to palliative care. And he writes, "Transcendence is probably the most powerful way in which one restores wholeness. Everybody has a transcendent dimension, a life of the spirit, which is most directly expressed in religion and the mystic traditions. When experienced, transcendence locates the person in a far larger landscape. Such an experience need not involve religion in any formal sense. However, in its transpersonal dimension, it is deeply spiritual. The quality of being greater and more lasting than an individual life gives an aspect of a person its timeless dimension. The profession of medicine appears to ignore the human spirit. When I see patients in nursing homes who have become only bodies, I wonder whether it is not their transcendent dimension that has been lost." And embodied in the notion of transcendence, I think, is the concept of consciousness beyond the sense of self. By disrupting the default mode, we have an opportunity to move away and reduce the significance of the self, which is actually potentially an artifact of the default mode. By disrupting the default mode, we can have an experience of consciousness beyond the sense of self. And I think this gives us a window into what consciousness might be, which we will discuss more later. But it gives us a direct window into the idea that consciousness is not something that emanates from the brain, but consciousness is something that is received by the brain. Now, embodied in this notion of transcendence is also the loss of demarcation between the subject and the object. And this was described, I think, beautifully by Aldous Huxley. This is difficult for me to read because it's convoluted, but bear with me. And he wrote this in The Doors of Perception, describing a relationship he had with the leg of the table. I spent several minutes not merely gazing at those bamboo legs, but actually being them, or rather being myself in them, or to still be more accurate, for I was not involved in the case, nor in a certain case were they, being my not self in the not self, which was the chair. Crazy sentence, crazy statement. But this is an attempt to use language to identify a non-dual experience. So the experience of non-duality is the experience of being conscious, but outside of self. We associate consciousness with self, and certainly people that practice Buddhism see that as an artifact of consciousness and not a reality of consciousness. The experience of non-duality is that we are all part of everything. We are in a state that we close our mind to, of oneness. I think oneness represents the very heart of the experience that we've been discussing. At the moment of dissolution of the self, we transcend the limits of our physical bodies. The experience defies description, but it is clear that several ideas become self-evident. There is a commonality of experience that is difficult to ignore. And I will close now with some quotes from the subjects of the NYU study with life-threatening cancer who received psilocybin. And these are quotes from the patients several weeks after they'd finished the study. I can't even imagine it, the fear of cancer. I felt this constant state of becoming. I felt gratitude like I'd never felt before in my life. I felt totally welcome. Death does not matter. Everything is love. Something else I experienced was the feeling that one is eternal and that all of existence happens in every moment. Right now, I have no fear of recurrence of cancer. It does not enter my mind. So with that, I conclude, we be aware that this is a vast subject, highly interesting, and there's a limitless number of books that are available to read. I would suggest that there are three principal ones that you would consider. This, of course, Michael Pollan's seminal book, I think is a great beginning, and it's a beautifully written book and describes much of the material that I've gone into, but in much greater depth, and it is an extremely rich book. I suggest it for everyone. This book is beautifully written and I think very powerful and important. This is Sacred Knowledge, the book by Bill Richards. And then I think perhaps in an area that we haven't discussed at all, but I think that quantum physics is extremely important in showing the unification of advanced scientific theory as it relates to specific spiritual issues. So the Tao of Physics, a book written many years ago, continues to be relevant and profound, and I think it's a great read. All of these others we discussed, but I think The Cosmic Serpent, fascinating read, Food of the Gods, the Terence McKenna book, and some of these others here. And hopefully we can make this list available for anyone that wants it. That's easy, but there are so many great reads. And if you're interested in what you heard tonight, I really recommend you treat yourself to a deeper exploration of the topic. So I thank you, and I'm ready for whatever questions you have.
Wow. Thank you very much, Dr. Cole. That was amazing. Yeah. Okay. Who's got the first question? And Diane, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Cole. It's very, very, I guess, enlightening. My mom suffers from dementia, Alzheimer's diagnosis, and she's in a memory care, and it's just continuing to progress at 77. She was early diagnosed, like 67, but I'm concerned at the very end that, of course, she will stop eating and all of that. Am I allowed to take any of this product into her facility, or would I have to remove her and put her in the care of a physician like yourself at the end?
Wow, that is a profound question, and it's never been placed to me before, and I would have to say that the problems with Alzheimer's disease and these forms of degenerative nervous system problems that relate to dementia is that I would never be comfortable giving a psychedelic medication to a patient with advanced dementia, principally because I could never prepare them for that. And I honestly, I can relate deeply to to the issues that you described. My father died of Alzheimer's disease, and it is a horrible, terrible disease. And it is one of the most difficult diseases, I believe, to experience, maybe not so much as a patient, but certainly as a relative of a patient. But I think that embodied in the idea of giving a psychedelic to a patient with advanced dementia is the issue of consent. And we need,
Yes.
This would be a profound distortion. And it would be a profound distortion of consciousness. And I would have to say, to do that would be a deeply experimental idea that I'm at this point not comfortable with. So that would be a barrier to that at this point. But that's one of the reasons why I certainly am looking forward to when these medications are available to all of us, and that we may be able to engage in those behaviors now before dementia ensues. And perhaps those insights that we may glean from that experience may help us create advanced directives for our care, and help us talk openly about dementia, so that we know exactly what our wishes are should we have those problems. The issue about Alzheimer's and dementia is a topic that I hold deeply close to my heart, and that is that's a different conversation, but it is a very interesting idea that you raised. I have great trepidation about giving these compounds to patients that I don't feel that can adequately consent. So that's one of the problems that I would have with that.
That's very fair. Thank you very much. And just to piggyback, what's the update on where this kind of compound will be readily available? Do you have anything to share with us?
Yeah, we know that right now MDMA is in phase 3, which is the final phase of FDA approval. And those studies are moving along rapidly and vigorously. And the data is profound, specifically for the application of MDMA for PTSD. And our patients are getting cured from PTSD with 1 or 2 sessions of MDMA. The issue with end-of-life anxiety We are in phase 3 as well. I think that that will follow MDMA and probably will not be available for maybe a year and a half. Things are so crazy in the world right now, and it's specifically in the United States, that I'm sometimes depressed that approval may be delayed beyond that. But I'm quite hopeful that certainly for patients with end-of-life anxiety, that these compounds will be available within the next year or two.
Very good. Thank you, doctor.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got a bunch of, we've got a couple more people that have their hands raised. We've got a bunch of questions in the chat line. Let me do one of the ones in the chat, and then I'll go back to the raised hand. Diane asked, to what do you attribute your recovery from melanoma?
Honestly, I recovered from melanoma because I had very good luck. I was lucky, and that's it. I was a recipient of multiple forms of immunotherapy. I kept looking for an immunotherapy that would work. I went to the National Cancer Institute and received one immunotherapy, and then I received a new experimental drug, which is now a mainline drug, which is called ipilimumab, and that, or anti-CTLA-4. And I was one of the 20% that has a significant response to that. I don't think that there was, anything that I did. I think I was basically very, very lucky, and I'm deeply grateful for that.
Great, thank you. Okay, Emily, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I was just wondering how you would compare the experience of psychedelics to those of near-death experience and also of Buddhist meditation.
Well, the elements of the near-death experiences are different, but I still think there is a sense. But I would say that near-death experiences almost always reveal a potential reality that is much greater and broader than our normal living, waking experience.
Mm-hmm.
There are characteristics of near-death experiences which involve meeting relatives, that involves being in a great state of calm. I think that state of calm has the same sort of reassurance that we find in psychedelic states, in a state of openness and non-duality. But the non-duality concept that we experience in a deep meditative experience in Buddhist meditation, in which the separation of the self from the non-self is utterly and completely blurred and is gone. And that sense of oneness, that is an experience that is engendered both in very advanced states of Buddhist meditation and other forms of meditative states, and psychedelics as well, and those have deep similarities.
Yeah, they're pretty parallel, you would say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Let me go back to the chat line for a minute. Pauline asks, what application will your comments have, if any, to a patient dying from COVID on a respirator facing imminent death?
You know, once again, that application is so outside our clinical experience that that it makes me nervous. And by being nervous, what I'm engendering is the notion that the mistakes of the 60s, by rushing too quickly into clinical applications before we have a clear understanding of what it is that we are doing, breaks the rules of potentially doing no harm. And that although I would love to be able to reassure that patient with a medication like this, if the idea that I could prepare a patient de novo on a ventilator at the edge of death and giving them a psychedelic experience is disturbing, because I worry that we are jumping ahead of ourselves, and we have to go slowly in this realm. I'm working right now actively with Hospice of the East Bay and other hospice groups throughout the country, thinking about the use of administering ketamine to patients that are in hospice. That research is just beginning, and we have many years to go of collecting information about the use of ketamine in that situation, which is a different compound with a different psychedelic signature, and whether that is reassuring. We have much to learn in that regard. Ultimately, several years down the road, with a lot more work and building a foundation of knowledge, we may be ready for that application, but we're a long way from now.
Great, and thank you. Next, someone whose name is W.S. Finn. You've got your hand raised. Why don't you go ahead and...
Yes, I do. William Feinlater. I know that DMT is produced by the pituitary gland, and it's naturally found at certain low levels in the bloodstream. Do you know of any studies recently who have maybe experimented with the idea that these meditators and maybe the old prophets that would wander out in the desert for 2 weeks without eating, maybe they had natural surges of DMT, which have effects that are similar to these other psychedelic drugs?
That is a hypothesis that has been certainly bantered about within the psychedelic community. At this point, it still stands as a hypothesis. The idea that there are psychoactive compounds, specifically DMT, that could be produced endogenously in the brain, and that through either practice or specific stimulation, which may happen near end of life, that may produce these compounds to ease the anxiety produced by the experience, is possible, and certainly within the realm of my imagination and many researchers. The difficulties of that study continue to be extensive, and the measuring the presence of DMT within the nervous system or within the bloodstream are beyond our capabilities right now, as I am aware. So it is certainly a subject that will be investigated, about the endogenous production of psychedelic compounds within the body by the body in certain states of either stress or meditative practice. I think it makes a great deal of sense, but as of yet, that research has not gone that far.
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Okay, and next one is
Stop sharing.
what is the therapeutic dose range for psilocybin?
Usually about 35 milligrams,
Okay,
between 30 and 40 milligrams is usually the dose.
great. And the next question is, how do you find a guide for a session with mushrooms?
There's a street corner in Berkeley that you need to go to between the hours of 10.
I thought you were going to say Craigslist.
Yeah, I think that's I cannot make a specific recommendation about that, but I would say that between social media contacts and the internet, I think that there is I can't say that there is a robust network of people that are working underground in this regard. But at the same time, there's no one that I can specifically recommend. And so I have to just stay quiet about that.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I had my thing on mute. I guess that's what, I'm sorry about that. Can I ask a question?
please, sir.
Okay, I have a son who suffers from treatment-resistant depression, and he also treats it with drink, with alcohol. And he's tried everything. He's a Kaiser patient. He's exhausted everything they have to offer, every single solitary, and he's even tried ketamine, all to no result. How does he go? How do we go about getting him enrolled in some type of a program that would allow him to try psilocybin? Is that possible?
Yeah, I think that what you need to do is there's a Center for Psychedelic Studies at both UC San Francisco and at Berkeley. I would contact those institutions and see if you can look for active research projects involved with psilocybin and depression.
Okay. So one more time, these.
It would be both UC San Francisco and UC Berkeley.
Okay. And what's the word you would use to get into the right department?
I think that I would look for the Department of Psychiatry at UC Berkeley. I mean, at UC San Francisco, and there is actually a division of UC Berkeley associated with psychedelic studies. I would contact both of those institutions and let them know your situation with your son, and hopefully you can make that connection.
Okay, that's worth it. So what role does MAPS play in this whole thing?
Well, MAPS is probably the most important institution right now in terms of organizing research projects, and actually, MAPS is not a bad connection for you to make. I would contact MAPS and see if there is a department available there to help refer people to appropriate research institutions. Right now, all of these compounds, specifically psilocybin, is illegal, and the only way to work with a licensed psychiatrist, and no psychiatrist is going to be involved in this who is licensed and credible with compounds that are illegal. So to do this all above board is really the best approach.
Well, I'm happy to do that as long as it produces hopefully some results.
Yeah, so I think contacting MAPS is an appropriate way of going as well. That could be a good resource.
Okay.
Good luck to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
I appreciate it.
Okay.
okay, and next one is, are there countries where these drugs are legal?
That's a great question, and I don't have the answer for that. I'm not sure what the status in Europe is for most of these compounds, but I'm not aware of any ongoing, any open access clinically for these compounds. So I'm not aware of that.
Okay. And a similar question, submitted by someone you happen to know, Ms. Ferret.
Oh my God. Now we know we're in trouble.
Yep. How would a person dying from cancer get access to this therapy?
That would be, right now, that would probably have to be through the underground. Or find an appropriate research study, either at UC San Francisco.
Rob, is there anything in the works right now to get these drugs legalized? Any studies that are being presented to the government? Or to all of the studies that are phase 3 studies involving psilocybin will be presented to the FDA, and they're all being collected for the FDA, and they are all being done under the auspices of the FDA. So there are many studies that are going on in multiple institutions throughout the country. And I will tell you, one of the good signs is that corporate America is rushing to become part of the bonanza associated with the use of these medications. There is a tremendous amount of money to be made, both from by the pharmaceutical industry and by the companies that are being generated to disseminate this form of therapy. So there are a lot of powerful interests that are interested in making these therapies available to people.
And as an aside, actually, as an aside to that, in the spirit of full and adequate disclosure, I have invested in, 5 real tiny companies that are attempting to do just this. I mean, not a lot of money each, about $500 each, but but it does look like you're absolutely right that it's, and that corporate America is ramping up as quick as they can.
When these compound, part of the reason is, and one of the interesting things is that we are, I'm belong to a program at the California Institute of Integrative Studies to train to become a psychedelic psychotherapist. And I'm part of a graduating class of about 300 both here in San Francisco and in Boston. And we are, there are many centers that are trying to build a curriculum and a licensing program and a way to establish credibility and certain standards for psychedelic psychotherapy, so that when these drugs become legal, that there will be a group of therapists available to people who will be wanting to have these experiences. And the scale up for that is going to take several years to happen.
Okay, thanks. And one of our other members, who is also an RN, says in Portland, there's a state-sponsored group that is developing protocol for guided psilocybin experience. And then she also says in Oakland, it is decriminalized.
This is a great point. I'm so glad that you made that. Yes, it is decriminalized in Oakland, yet licensed therapists and physicians administering in Oakland are still subject to liability issues and legality issues associated with both the state and the federal government.
Right.
Which means that creating an environment that is as small as Oakland, to create that area, that island of safety, is an island that I'm afraid is not quite big enough. And I think that most people, most therapists will be waiting until we have something more definitive. The experiment in Oregon, and the state wrote some very interesting new laws, which are allowing for the use of psilocybin in the form of mushrooms, which to be used for patients and therapy, a wide variety of applications that we've discussed. And I think that will result in a very interesting experience. I am sure, I have a son who lives in Portland, and I am sure that as the Portland experience begins to roll out, there will be a move of therapists that wish to be participating in that process, and they will be moving into the Oregon area. And once we get a sense of how safe that is, most of us who are physicians do not want to run the risk of losing our licenses. And so with it continuing to be illegal on a federal level, there are concerns about how that will ultimately play out legally. But I do think the experiment in Oregon is quite interesting, and Oregon is moving forward earnestly and quickly and expeditiously to make the possibility for psychedelic psychotherapy utilizing mushrooms very soon. And that experience will happen within the next year.
Great, thank you. Another person wants to know if you're familiar with the work of Baroness Amanda, I think it's Fielding.
Yes. And her foundation is remarkable, and it's doing much work. Amanda is an amazing person and has funded great and important research in this field. Yes.
Great. The next one, and we might be getting near the end, so you might get, oh, someone just popped another one, sorry. The one before that is, if one were to acquire some psychedelic mushrooms, how would you know the dosage?
That's difficult. And,
Yep.
and so you don't know the dosage. I think that if there's anything that I can say is that I think it's important for us to be respectful of the use of these medications. They are profoundly powerful and dangerous in many respects if used without the knowledge of understanding set and setting. And so I can't advocate, I'm not advocating the use of these medications without appropriate support right now.
Yep, it's understandable. Yeah, and the follow-on question from another person was, so what do we look for in procuring mushrooms, quote unquote, off market?
I can't answer that. Because I really don't know. And honestly, I have not purchased or consumed mushrooms in the recent past. So I cannot speak with any knowledge or ability in that regard. So I really can't make a recommendation for that. I'm so sorry.
No, that's totally understandable. Okay. Lynn wants to know, and I'm presuming she's talking about psilocybin mushrooms. Will they grow in our climate?
Yeah.
Obtain seeds from the internet?
The truth is if any of you in the audience wish to grow psilocybin mushrooms, growing them in an environment in your apartment or your home is easy. The spores are all readily available on the internet.
Great, there you go. I think we're going to spawn a new underground industry here in Rossmore.
I think that's possible, and I know I will be held responsible for that.
No. We didn't hear anything. So. Okay, and does anyone else have one? Otherwise, we're going to let the good doctor go off and enjoy the
I
rest
have
of
a
it.
question, another one, Brad.
Go ahead, Diane.
I'm curious about epilepsy. I know I hear the end of life, but do you have any experience with epileptic patients?
In what regards? How do you
Well,
mean?
I'm just saying, does it help improve their prognosis, or does it reduce the grand mal seizures? Or, I don't know. My nephew was diagnosed at 21. He's 32 now. He's gone through the whole sleep study over at Kaiser Redwood City and Epilepsy Center, and he might be a candidate for a brain implant. But having no life to look forward to until he can get this disease under control, it's just horrible to witness a 32-year-old just be medicated all the time, And so I was just curious if you had the experience of working with anybody with this kind of brain disorder.
Well, I'm not a neurologist, but I work in hospice with patients that do have seizure disorders. That being said, as it relates to psychedelics, it does not probably make sense pharmacologically that a psychedelic would have an impact on the development of seizures or the treatment of seizures. In fact, psychedelics potentially have stimulative qualities, and it is possible that psychedelics could be responsible for the generation of epileptic seizures. It's possible. That's theoretical. It's never really been seen. But that being said, I'm not sure if I see that on the therapeutic horizon for psychedelics right now. But there is so much to learn, and there is so much experimentation and so much potential that I can't say more than that, and I would never rule anything out.
Very good, thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, and someone posted in the chat that a local forager who gathered for restaurants told me that they grow in the hills around Rossmore, but it requires expert knowledge to pick them out from harmful mushrooms.
Yes, and it's important to understand that
Yep.
consuming the wrong mushrooms can result in acute liver failure and require liver transplants. So I'm not going to be advising anyone to be foraging for psilocybin mushrooms without profound experience in that regard.
Right. Or significant threshold for risk.
Right.
Okay, next one is, I understand hospice mainly used morphine for pain and anxiety. Yeah, is there any other choice?
The bottom line is that probably lorazepam is one of the best drugs we can use for management of anxiety. And opiates are also helpful in that regard. These are mainstays drugs, and they have side effects of sleepiness and disorientation. And so it's one of the profound problems associated with the treatment of end-of-life anxiety and end-of-life pain. One of the things that, as we said, I think that by using psychedelics as people approach end of life, it is possible that we may reduce the anxiety associated with the pain. And by reducing that anxiety, we're actually reducing the quality of the pain. When death means something different than the way death means before we've experienced psychedelic experiences, that we can change the nature of the pain, and I think reduce it when we are less concerned about ourselves.
Right, okay. And so, Mr. W.S. Finn, you've got your hand up again. You want to unmute yourself? And
Yeah, I just had the thought that 8 years ago, the marijuana club was very, very small. And maybe somebody that's listening to this can start the idea of having a psychedelic medicine club where and it could have members that were experts at mushroom identification.
Diane?
well, I'm presuming that most of you know that the Rossmore Medical Marijuana Club has merged with the Rossmore Wellness Group, and so we become one, and so my bet is you'll see more talks on topics like this over the coming months and years, in addition to cannabis, and in addition to other alternative health topics. So
I would just like to make a comment.
I think that would be appropriate.
All of us in this age group represent a profoundly powerful political force. Mm-hmm. And because we have time, many of us have the finances to pursue what we want to pursue. We should have a right to be less afraid of dying. And we are closer to dying than the rest of the population. And I think it lies with us to move this forward politically. We have enough science right now to recognize that psychedelics in the appropriate hands, with the appropriate therapy under the auspices of the appropriate institutions, can be administered safely and can radically alter a population's perception of death and literally change the culture. Because there are several things that happen as a result of patients that have psychedelic experiences. One of which is that there's an awareness of an integration between all life forms on the planet, and this notion of oneness and being aware of our connection with the whole of the biosphere that we are all an integral part of. We are part of a large organism which exists and spans across the entire globe. And part of our ability to heal the planet will result, our responsibility to achieve those goals may be achieved through the use of these plant medicines. And I believe that it is time that that groups like this come together to create a stronger political force to move these drugs forward through FDA approval. If we consider the travesties that were associated with Sackler Pharmaceuticals and the tens of thousands of human beings that died over the last the hundreds of thousands of people that died over the last few years, the idea that the FDA may slow this down because of their insecurity about hierarchical power structures is absurd, and it needs to be taken head on. Every day that goes by in which people are frightened about the progression of cancers and of illnesses and are unable to live their lives with their eyes open to a greater, potentially more reassuring reality is a travesty. So I beseech all of you to take political power in your own hands.
Thank you. That's a very good message, and delivered to a potentially receptive audience. I'm not sure you're aware of it, but among the somewhere between 150 to 200 different clubs here in Rossmore is the Democrats of Rossmore, which has over 1,200 paid members. It is literally the largest Democratic Party club in the world, and it's a when it gets riled up, it's a force to reckon with. And so if we combine a number of the clubs, there's a lot we can do.
There's an amazing amount that you can do. So I am an advocate for you, and any way I can help, I'm with you.
Right. And Ellen just reminded me that I've been remiss in not giving you a chance to tell us how we can make use of your services. Do you have a general practice or a private practice that's open to the general public?
My practice is I see my medical practice is specifically through hospice. I come to Rossmore all the time to see patients, and my counseling practice is with patients with end of life anxiety and life-threatening illness. And I'm available to see patients. I see patients principally over Zoom right now. I'm available to see patients. I see patients sliding scale. My sole purpose in life is reducing anxiety related to advancing disease and the specter of death.
Right. And am I remembering correctly that the website for your private practice is drrobbcole@md.com?
That does not sound that familiar with me.
Okay, honestly. Then it's probably an imposter or my memory is lost.
Okay, so the easiest way to reach me. So if anyone wants to reach me, my number is 925-788-3924. Please don't call me tonight because I got to get some dinner. And you can go to robbcolemd.com. So that's ROBBCOLEMD.com, and look at my website, and you can always reach me. Okay.
So that means I did have it right.
You did. I had it wrong.
That's okay. And
thank you very much. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was. Thank you very much. And I think it's safe to say we owe you dinner.
Well, we'll do
Or
that
at least a
sometime.
cocktail party with stuffed mushrooms.
Hey, Lynn, as long as Mark's cooking, that's fine.
Yo, girl, I'll cook them.
I
Okay,
love it.
great.
Now repeat the phone number.
925
Slow.
788-3924. So I guess, Brad, I will sign off. I want to thank
Right.
everyone for your attention. I hope you found the topic interesting. I hope I did it justice, and I look forward to our next interaction. And it is the experience of speaking at Rossmore is a great experience for me, and the community is an amazing resource. And I hope you find even more political power than you have now.
Thank you very much. And I think I can speak for everyone else that, we will be calling you to come back to speak probably before the pain of this one is worn off. So,
Thank you so much for coming to us.
And
Yes.
Zora, thank you so much for prodding me to get this done. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It was great.
Yeah,
Take care. Good night to everyone.
Good
good
night.
night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for, for coming and sticking with us to the end.
See you later.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks, Brad.
You're welcome, Ellen. Thank you. Thanks, Zora. Thanks, Tess.
Thank you, Zora. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, we have to thank, it took 2.5 years to get this to come about, but
Oh,
I'm very grateful that we were finally able to manage it.
well, I thank everyone involved. It was enlightening and reassuring. It was great.
That was a wonderful talk.
It was.
He did a really good job for us. And he really wanted to,
Oh, yeah. You could tell. It was obvious.
He obviously has made the journey and he's walking his talk.